Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Allow me to thank you for joining our debate today. My name is Leonela Leca, and together with my colleague, Federica Prandin, we are leading GlobeSec's flagship initiative, the CE Energy Hub. Our work is focusing on meeting the need for cross-sectoral dialogue between institutional and private stakeholders on energy and the green transition. Analyzing and understanding the latest trends in these domains with the goal of informing policy and investment decisions have been at the core of our activities. Today's workshop is part of a series of events organized under our CE Energy Hub, and it is co-founded by the European Union. Our debate will tackle the topic of the green transition, a topic that is not only shaping the agendas on both sides of the Atlantic, but also has a broader implication on the global level. In an international system that is becoming more and more multipolar, the green transition can trigger or, on the contrary, can block the future competitiveness of the major global players. The discussions comes at a time when polarization over the green agenda divides society. Therefore, the upcoming elections in the EU, but also in the United States, are sparking heated debates on the economic rationale and the ability to fulfill the ambitious targets. The debates on how to combine climate action, social justice, and democratic politics is an ongoing one and demands solutions. Today, we will try to understand, ahead of the 2024 EP elections, where do we stand? Is the green transition exacerbating polarization among voters and regions of Europe? Ladies and gentlemen, we are delighted to welcome today our outstanding speakers. And as the topic is one that triggers polarization, I might say that our panel is quite polarized today as well. In our attempt to bring experts, academia, politicians, and practitioners from both the United States and the European Union, we would like our audience to understand the arguments and to assess the challenges and opportunities ahead. Without further ado, allow me to present our first panelist. Diana Furchtgott-Roth, Director of the Center for Energy, Climate and Environment at the Herbert and Joyce Morgan Fellow in Energy and Environmental Policy at the Heritage Foundation. Diana worked in senior roles in the White House under President Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and George W. Bush. She has served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Research and Technology at the U.S. Department of Transportation, Acting Assistant Secretary for Economic Policy at the U.S. Department of Treasury, Chief Economist at the U.S. Department of Labor, Chief of Staff of the President's Council on Economic Advisors, and Deputy Executive Secretary of the White House Domestic Policy Council. Diana, thank you for joining us today. It's been roughly a year since Congress made extraordinary investments to help accelerate a transition to clean energy. Private sector investments has surged, exceeding combined clean power investments for the prior 8 years. However, the newfound ambition to build a clean energy economy by mid-century has exposed fundamental flaws in approving and connecting energy projects that, if not addressed soon, will make this goal very difficult. What are the trade-offs that need to be made for a truly green transition from your point of view?
Well, Leonela, thank you so much for that question, and thank you so much for organizing the conference. I want to welcome our online guests and thank them for participating. All of us want clean air and clean water, and the question is, how do we get there, and what is the best way? And that is where the debate lies. No one is debating the importance of clean air and clean water and the importance of a good environment. What it appears to us here in the United States, and also from the viewpoint of the Western world, is that we are imposing trillions of euros of costs on our economies in the West. And that is resulting in a movement of energy-intensive manufacturing to China, which is not reducing global emissions. And that to us seems to be a fundamental problem. Because if we make regulations about manufacturing and about emissions of carbon in Western Europe, in the United States, with the result that the manufacturing moves to China and is made in a dirtier manner, because China has fewer regulations on its energy than Europe and the United States, we are not reducing global emissions. Instead, we are hollowing out the economies of the West and benefiting the economies of Asia, where the products are made. And to us, it seems as though that this is one of the fundamental problems. In the United States, just last week, there was a strike by the United Auto Workers, the car workers. And the Democratic Party has been, is a combination of two different groups, the Greens and the Blues. The Greens are the environmentalists, and the blue-collar workers are those who want to work in the factory jobs. And this strike has exposed a schism between the Blues and the Greens, a fracturing of the Democratic coalition. And I think that we see some of this in countries all over the world. So the environmentalists want to go for net zero 2050. They're in favor of electric vehicles. They're in favor of wind turbines. They're in favor of solar panels. And the Blues, the blue-collar workers, they want their jobs. They see in the United Auto Workers, who represent the workers at Ford, Stellantis, and General Motors, they see the move to electric vehicles as just shipping the jobs to China rather than having them in the United States. They see that the electric vehicle manufacturers are getting large amounts of money, that consumers are getting tax credits to purchase the electric vehicles. Meanwhile, it's not just their jobs that are being rendered obsolete. It is also the jobs of the auto parts suppliers, the jobs of the mechanics at your local garage who are not going to be able to mend your car anymore. Instead, an electrician will mend the car, or the Chinese company that makes the electric vehicle or the Tesla will mend the car. So there is a great deal of political disruption. The question is what to do about it, how to navigate our goal of clean air and water while keeping everybody on board. Well, through the use of natural gas replacing coal, the United States has decreased carbon emissions by 1,000 million metric tons over the past 15 years. And during that time, Chinese emissions have increased by 5,000 million metric tons. We believe on the political right here in the United States that what needs to be done is spread the technology of clean natural gas and also revive nuclear power, which is dense, emissions-free energy. We think that the spread of this technology, not just within the United States and Europe, but also to Asia, is going to reduce total carbon emissions. And we cannot reduce emissions just by moving our manufacturing offshore if the countries to which we are moving it are not progressing in a clean direction. If they are not progressing in a clean direction, we are just moving emissions from one place on the globe to another place on the globe without reducing total emissions. It's notable that when the American envoy, the climate envoy John Kerry, went to China, at that time, President Xi of China gave a speech saying that China will not peak its emissions in 2030 and then reduce them. the way it had stated in the Paris Agreement. Instead, it would peak emissions on its own timetable, not on a Western timetable. Previously, a year ago, President Xi said they would reduce carbon emissions only when renewables took the place of fossil fuels. The trouble is, we think that that's never going to happen. We are never going to get rid of fossil fuels completely, because even if we were to paper the United States over with solar panels and wind turbines, and that goes for Europe too, we still need fossil fuels to make the wind turbines and to repair the wind turbines and to make the solar panels. So we're never going to get rid of dense energy. Plus, people in Africa, Latin America, whose standards of living are far below ours, who many times do not have electricity, they don't have running water, they are not going to be able to achieve Western standards of living with renewables alone. They are going to need dense sources of energy in order to reach our level. And we cannot be telling them, look, Rwanda, Côte d'Ivoire, Burkina Faso, you manage with renewables. We have natural gas-fired power plants. We have nuclear power, but we're not going to let you have it. You have to get by with solar panels and turbines. And that does not make any sense at all. It's not morally right. So a lot of people here see the push for intermittent electricity from renewables, which is more expensive than continuous energy from fossil fuels, to be disproportionately affecting poor people all over the world, farmers and small business, and also affecting the supply of food, which is very important. So our conclusion is that rather than focusing on net zero 2050, which we don't think will happen, we need to be focusing on spreading natural gas technology, hydrofracturing, natural gas power plants, nuclear energy, which does not produce any emissions. And the EU recently declared that natural gas and nuclear were clean fuels. And if that is propagated around the world and in Asia, then we will be a lot more successful, both in terms of lower electricity prices and environmental justice, because the poor will have access to low electricity prices and continuous resilient supplies of energy the way we have in the West. Thank you very much.
Diana, thank you very much for this insightful presentation. I think we would rather start the second presentation because we would have an open Q&A debate at the end of our webinar. So our second panelist is Martin Hojsik, a Slovak member of the European Parliament. Martin has been actively involved in nature and animal protection for over 25 years. Since 2019, he serves as a member of the European Parliament, working to avert the climate threat, protect biodiversity and animals with a specific focus on pollinators. Furthermore, he strives to regulate hazardous chemicals and promote safe and wholesome food. He's an active MEP in 4 committees: Environment, Public Health, and Food Safety, Industry, Research and Energy, and Budget. More recently, he has been appointed as Vice Chair in Animal Transport Committee. In the past, he served as a Program Director of the Animal Protection Organization for POLS. Mr. Hojsik, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and thank you for organizing this event. I think it's a really important discussion, although, you know, this is not about air pollution. This is not about water pollution. This is about climate, something that, in terms of the climate science, sadly, a number of the actors on the right, especially in the US, including the Heritage Foundation, has been denying, underlying, and lying about for many, many, many years. And this is about opportunity for development. Our reliance will start with where we have a problem in terms of the energy supply, because I'm not going to go into repeating of the incredible costs that the societies, especially the societies in the developing country, in the global south, are bearing already and are going to bear due to our emissions of greenhouse gases, including those from fossil gas, including methane and other greenhouse gases that are resulting in countless deaths and billions and trillions of costs that the societies and that are most vulnerable to them all are having to bear. Now, to give you a perspective from Central and Eastern Europe, we have been highly reliant on fossil gas and increasing our reliance on fossil gas over the years, especially hooking up to the fossil gas from Russia, despite the fact that the Russians had, as a part of their foreign policy, a plan to use the raw resources they are exporting as a weapon. We weaponized Putin, and it, by doing so, we also were proactively destroying the climate. Now we have to bear the fruits in terms of the costs of energy, which have increased due to the price shocks that were caused by Putin squeezing the supply of fossil gas to Europe. And it has served as a wake-up call. It has served as a wake-up call for many in Europe, and that's where I was happy to see over the last few years a really substantial development in renewables, in energy efficiency, which actually, based on the most recent LCOE calculations, are the most cheapest sources of electricity. I believe that this is the energy that we need to use to be truly independent. This is the energy that needs to power our future. And this is something which, it's not call of the activists. It's call of the International Energy Agency, which I would say is a fairly conservative institution that is very pragmatic and, science-based in terms of their projections and their plans. And they see exactly wind, solar, storage solutions as the solution for climate. Sadly, any fossil fuels, especially fossil gas, are source of a greenhouse gas emission. And if we actually believe in science, not believe actually, science is not about believing. If we trust scientists, then there is no way we can increase our consumption of fossil fuels. Now, on the positive note, I agree that we should not be moving our industries to countries which have worse emissions. This is something which has been going on and has been underpinned by the policies that were looking at free trade agreements without any underlying social environmental clauses, just like those propagated by the Republicans in the United States and the kind of the right wing in Europe. That's something which we need to change, and I'm happy to hear, and I will hope that the right in the US will support similar policies as we do as we have in the European Union. For example, CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, because CBAM is something which is providing us with exactly what we need: a fair play. I believe in free market, but free market needs to be a fair market. And yes, we have a situation where we should be putting a fee, it's not a tax, on imports from countries which are not following the same and are not implementing the same climate objectives as we do. And I think this is something which we can find a common ground with the United States, and looking forward not only in terms of the greenhouse CO2 emissions, but hopefully also in terms of the methane emissions, because as the International Energy Agency says, we have to tackle the methane emissions, which is 80 times more potent greenhouse gas than CO2, in order to stay within the path and have a chance of reaching maximum heating by 1.5 degrees Celsius. So working together is important. I'm happy that I see a number of the large industry players being very active in this field, realizing, so to say, the mistakes of the past. And I give you an example from outside of automotive, because automotive has been in Europe successfully fighting against the move to non-combustion engines and non-combustion propulsion at their own detriment. But now I give you an example from a chemical industry. Chemical industry 15 years ago was opposing inclusion of hazardous chemicals in kind of restriction in articles in imports. In a simple words, they were protecting their offshoring of production from Europe, so they could produce something which causes cancer, put it in a product in China and import it. Right now, the chemical industry has woken up to the problem and actually is very much supporting the fact that we need to make sure that we're not importing hazardous chemicals in products, because it's undermining the level playing field. It's not even about environmental health protection, it's about level playing field. So yes, what we need to have is a system where we have a very clear level playing field between the countries that also includes the environmental conditions and the green and associated greenhouse gas emissions. And this is not going to be achieved by the spreading of use of more fossil fuels. It's going to be achieved by more and more and wider use of renewable energy. Now, one last comment to the push for the use of the fossil gas. To say that the developing countries need to use fossil gas to satisfy their energy needs is similar to me to saying that they need landlines. I spent 3 years working in the development sector, chasing the tax avoidance by multinationals, which deprive the least developed countries of the much needed revenue for public services due to tax avoidance. And one of the countries I visited was Malawi, one of the countries lowest on the Human Development Index. This was 10 years ago, and you wouldn't believe they had the state-of-the-art 3G. They didn't have landlines. These countries have huge opportunity for leapfrogging rather than trying to have stranded investments into fossil infrastructure, into fossil fuels use. Because as no one else than the president of the European Investment Bank, the largest public finance institution in Europe, Werner Hoyers, is saying, the transformation to renewables, the saving of the climate is the best business opportunity of our age. And if we don't use it, then it's going to be at our own peril and the loss of our own competitiveness. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. I also think that it is very important to move from legislation to implementation and to have opportunity to use new business models, because in the end, this will become the driver of the green transition. But in the meantime, I think we have a short comment from Diana, just maybe in a couple of minutes, because then we will move to our next speaker. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you very, very much for giving me the opportunity to respond. I would just like to say very briefly that the Heritage Foundation is not lying. I think this is a civilized debate. I don't think we should accuse other people of lying. I would certainly never accuse Martin of lying. I would also like to say that if the government models that we have imported from the Energy Department and the Environmental Protection Agency show that even if we completely stopped using all fossil fuels in the United States, it would reduce global temperatures by 0.2 degrees Celsius by the year 2100. That this is not going to make a big difference in terms of climate. Developing countries, emerging economies, they need resilient power. You cannot have a wind farm without a backup natural gas power plant, because when the wind stops, you need the natural gas to kick up and power the electricity. And intermittent energy costs more than continuous energy. So it costs more to run the wind farm on and off with the gas in between than it will cost to run the gas completely, the gas continuously. And a carbon tax, we would argue, would raise prices disproportionately on the poor. There are people who say, well, you can lower their income taxes. They don't pay income taxes anyway, low-income people. But we will never be able to have Africa and Latin America reach the standards of the West completely on renewables, if only because you need the fossil fuels to back up the renewables. So it's an impossibility.
Well, I dare to disagree. You don't. That's simply not true. And I'm just one simple question, Madam. Do you trust the scientists' call and the need to achieve net zero in terms of greenhouse gas emission by 2050? Do you subscribe to the conclusions of the IPCC? Is this something we have to achieve in order to not face really destructive and massive destruction of our society? Is this something which you say that this is true, this is what we have to finally achieve, and let's discuss how to achieve this? Because for me, this is the key question.
I'm sorry to
2050. Oh, I would say net zero 2050 is a myth. We cannot achieve net zero 2050. And if you
no, the question was different. Sorry. Do you subscribe to the conclusions of the IPCC?
Do I subscribe to the conclusion that we need to achieve net zero by 2050 to stop the destruction of the planet? No, I don't believe that. Of course not.
Okay. I think that this debate is pretty much pointless, because this is something which, for me, is questioning the fundamentals of the sciences. I'm not going to go into discussion whether vaccination is good or whether is flat. For me, there is a very clear scientific consensus on the need to achieve climate neutrality, on the costs that we're gonna bear, and basically subscribing to the conclusions of the IPCC. This is not about negative. This is essentially about the scientific consensus trying to achieve what we need.
Allow me to intervene a little bit. I would like to continue our discussion and to listen to all of our presenters, and then to engage in the direct debate. So if you allow me, let's keep this question in mind and move to our next speaker. We have Elisabetta Cornago, Senior Research Fellow at the Center for European Reform, where she works on EU energy and climate policy from an economics perspective. Recently, she has been focusing on the impacts of the energy crunch on the EU's economic and energy policy, on the EU emissions trading scheme and carbon border adjustment mechanism. Before joining the CIR, Elisabetta worked as an environmental economist at OECD. More recently, she worked on energy efficiency policy at the International Energy Agency. Elisabetta, in her State of the Union reflections on the Green Deal, Ursula von der Leyen made a point of framing EU Green Deal as a growth strategy, and not only as an ambitious set of environmental, energy, and climate policies. What should be, in your view, the next steps in order for the EU to ensure competitiveness in the global market? How will the European Union balance the free trade and the de-risking value chains?
Thank you, Leonela. Thank you for this invite. Before diving into EU policy, which, as I understand, should be the focus of this webinar, allow me to just strongly state my agreement with what MEP Hojsik has just stated. I think it's unfortunate that we have to have a discussion that starts from questioning the evidence that's clearly been put on the table by the IPCC. There is a need, as we know, to cut carbon emissions. And there is a clear technological pathway to allow us to do that in a way that's cost efficient, as signaled, among others, by respectable institutions like the International Energy Agency in just even yesterday's updated report on its net zero pathway that shows that net zero by 2050 is achievable on a global scale with technologies that are largely commercially available today. and with technologies that are undergoing important cost cuts as we speak. So, this is just to reiterate points that have been very rightly put forward by the previous speaker, MEP Hojsik, and just to, I think, put a line under this bizarre, I would say, start of the webinar. Now, if we move then to EU policy, what I'd like to do to begin with is to look back for a moment at the impacts of the energy crisis and how it has affected also EU policy developments, and then look ahead, right, as we think about the implications for the upcoming election next year, interplay between EU energy and climate policy and industrial developments, as Leonela was just pointing to. Now, in terms of market developments, I think what has been very interesting to observe is that what we have learned from the energy crisis that Europe has been facing in the past 2 years or so, in a more acute way, obviously, as Russia aggressed Ukraine at the beginning of 2022, is that the energy transition can be an engine not only for decarbonization, but also for energy security and affordability. And I think this realization is really what has been backing an important boost in investments in renewables and energy efficiency technologies such as clean heating that we have been observing in large regions of the EU. So why is that? Because these are now perceived, again, not only as a tool towards decarbonization goals, but also as an insurance against high energy prices, thanks to the fact that the cost competitive technologies that we now rely upon when it comes to renewables installations, when it comes to clean heating, are now coming to fruition for a large set of European consumers. What this means is that we see projections that most EU member states should be able to meet renewable energy goals ahead of 2030 schedule. We see also positive examples of embracing clean technologies such as, for example, heat pumps, also in countries that were not necessarily known for their engagement, let's say, in climate targets and in climate policies, such as, for example, the heat pump installation boom in Poland. So these are, let's say, some positive market developments. Let me then point a bit to the policy developments at EU level in the aftermath of the energy crisis, and then sort of look at some shortcomings before looking at the perspective ahead of the elections. Now, what I think is interesting and a good indication of the EU's commitment to its climate action leadership is that the centerpieces of the Fit for 55 package, which is the set of climate and energy policies that the EU has designed or that has designed and put forward in order to meet its 2030 climate goals on the way towards net zero by 2050, has been passed into law largely, I would say, untouched, and on the other hand, strengthened to a certain extent by the energy crisis. 3 examples on this. The EU ETS, the EU emissions trading scheme reform, has moved forward. We see an improved commitment to carbon prices, not only when it comes to sectors that were already covered by carbon pricing so far in the EU, as MEP Hojsik was pointing to, also with the introduction of CBAM, but we've also seen a sort of a reiteration of carbon prices as one of the primary tools of EU climate policy when it comes to extending then their implementation to also sectors of the economy that were previously not covered by an EU-wide carbon price, namely heating and road transport. And the way the EU then is trying to balance the impact of carbon prices as an incentive for decarbonization and the need for social justice and to bring consumers along in energy transition is by absorbing then an important part of these revenues from carbon pricing into public finance initiatives that can offset the potential regressive distributional impacts of this type of policy. And the Social Climate Fund, agreed at EU level, I think is a good example of that. Of course, we can always expand them, and I, among others, have been one of those that have been calling for an improved and more ambitious, I think, approach to making better use of carbon pricing revenues. but I think the path is clear. Carbon pricing can be a progressive climate action tool insofar as its revenues are used in a good way to support particularly vulnerable consumers and to support technological innovation. That's just one example. If we look at the way in which directives such as the Energy Efficiency Directive, but also the Renewable Energy Directive have been recast EU level just in recent months, they both show that the ambition has been upped to 2030, and also has been upped with respect to what the Commission had been initially tabled, also partly because of the recognition that the energy crisis requires us to go faster and to be more ambitious on the way to 2050 in order to strengthen our energy security. Is everything rosy? Not really, no, there have been hiccups as well, and we continue to see some resistance, particularly when it comes to some very sensitive files, again, in climate action at EU level. One example is that around the energy performance of buildings directive, so the fact that there is some resistance to introducing more ambitious policy tools such as energy efficiency standards that would require homeowners to invest in improving the energy efficiency of buildings and reducing, in this respect, then the energy consumption required by the building sector. Now, I think, again, what the energy crisis has shown is that the poor are those that really are most vulnerable to poorly insulated and not energy efficient building sector. And we shouldn't be portraying then an improvement of policy addressing the shortcomings of this sector as an attempt to weaken the most vulnerable parts of society, but on the other hand, shape them in a way that can enable even those that today may not have access to affordable and efficient housing, allow them to access then this type of investment that can ensure they live in a comfortable and an efficient type of housing. So rather than stopping policy efforts to go towards more ambitious targets for sectors that have been lagging behind, such as buildings, shape them in such a way that carbon emission cuts in those sectors can be also socially just. Now, let me perhaps point to the fact also that obviously member states are different. So when we think about how to meet then these ambitious targets, there is a great deal of variation when it comes to how these targets are translated at national level and how different EU member states ascribe, I think, to this ambition. And of course, this can be different, and we're all very, very well aware of that. The response to the energy crisis has been very heterogeneous. For example, Hungary has increased its domestic production of fossil fuels, delaying the phase out of coal power, something that very much goes then against its own interest when it comes to continuing to tag along the very energy sources whose prices are affected by the crisis. In Bulgaria, previous commitments to decarbonize the power sectors could also be reversed, some rather worrying type of development. And yet we see reports such as, for example, one by Amber, that the potential for increasing the role of renewables in the power system in Central and Eastern European countries is up to 60% in 2030. So there is great potential that is there to be reaped also in Central and Eastern Europe when it comes to embracing the energy transition, and with that making the power system more resilient, more energy secure, and exposed to them, not exposed anymore to the volatility of fossil fuel prices, and on the other hand, benefiting from the lower costs of renewable energy technologies. The next step, of course, to meet targets is for European governments to implement everything that is necessary in order to achieve these goals that I've been pointing to as inscribed in the Fit for 55 package. And if we look ahead, I think what is clear when it comes to political priorities ahead of the election is that von der Leyen has been pointing to a focus on the industrial green transition. So we know that industry has been one of the, particularly heavy industry has been one of the sectors struggling, I think, with accelerating its decarbonization. And so, yes, the ETS has been providing an important price signal, but insofar as free allowances remain, that can be a muted signal. CBAM will do so that signal will come fully into the view of industrial players, coupling that with a clear sort of industrial strategy to point basically towards 2050 net zero also for heavy emitting sectors, I think is important. Perhaps one worry I have is that if we hear the State of the Union speech of von der Leyen, the cost of living energy crisis was portrayed as a thing of the past, perhaps, which to a certain extent I think is true. Europe has been weathering the storm, but we shouldn't be complacent, and we should make sure that we do not lose sight of the energy poverty challenges that can still be on the way out there. And to conclude, I think what is important is to highlight that the alternative to the energy transition is not a low-cost business as usual scenario. A slower transition, no transition, bring along, in fact, other types of costs, bigger type of costs than the ones that are entailed by investment in green technologies. And this has been very clear, again, as European consumers have been exposed to very volatile fossil fuel costs. The cost of climate inaction have been very visible, not only in Europe, but across the globe, really, as extreme weather events, become more and more commonplace and bring important destruction costs that hit both households and businesses. And there is, of course, the risk of incurring into stranded assets if we continue installing things like gas boilers, at micro level, or gas transmission infrastructure at macro level. So all these are the cost of climate inaction, and we shouldn't disregard them as we think about how to move ahead with Europe's green transition. Let me stop here.
Thank you, Elisabetta. A lot of food for thought, and I'm sure we will continue after all our speakers will present. Now let's move to the academia, and allow me to invite Marco Siddi. Marco is leading researcher at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, where he coordinates the project, The Global Politics of the Energy Transition. He is adjunct professor in world politics at the University of Helsinki and in international relations at Tampere University. He is also a board member of the Trans-European Policy Studies Association, a steering committee member of the ECPR Research Network on Energy Politics, Policy and Governance, and a member of the European Leadership Network, Younger Generation Leaders Network on Euro-Atlantic Security. From the war in Ukraine to worsening climate change, we know, of course, that the EU is facing this intense pressure to accelerate its green transition. In your opinion, Marco, and in line with what the other presenters already stated, what are the potential or the major obstacles that may arise on the road to the energy security of the European Union?
Okay, thank you very much for this kind introduction, Leonela. Let me say that polarization of voters is perhaps not the main challenge in Europe. If we look at Eurobarometer surveys, we see that climate change has been a top issue for a long time. So European citizens, not all of them, but most of them understand the climate challenge. And of course, as was pointed out right now, they also see it with their own eyes every summer, and not only in the summer, actually. There are, however, several challenges, and I would say that the European Union is, while going in the right direction, there have been adjustments or rhetoric that is not helping necessarily. For example, the geopolitical rhetoric of Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, while understandable, does not necessarily go hand in hand with the multilateralism that you need to tackle climate change. To tackle climate change, it's a global issue, you need international cooperation. So if you dress this with constant geopolitical talk about China being a rival, it's difficult to find that cooperation, that level of trust that that you would need. There have also been policy measures that, you know, if you read them carefully, they're not just about climate action. For example, the Repower EU plan talks about 10 billion euros for LNG terminals to import LNG to Europe, and it was already stressed that gas, so methane, is a very powerful greenhouse gas. On top of this, compared to the US, Europe does not have gas, really, or definitely not enough gas for its needs. So we also have to import it over long distances. And while there are geopolitical reasons for this, we have seen a switch from gas via pipeline to LNG over longer distances, and also from partners that are not necessarily you know, easy to work with. Qatar, for example, we've seen the Qatar scandal in the European Parliament just a few months ago. So we have to keep this in mind. Another challenge, again, these are not arguments for not doing anything or continuing as we are now. Social consequences are also very important. Using the traditional capitalist mechanisms for the energy transition means that you inject a lot of public funds into the economy, and there is a risk that they go to the usual suspects or to private entities that simply make investments without taking risks, because the risks are borne by the public sector via the subsidies. Of course, this is a pattern we have seen in the fossil fuel sector for a very long time. Oil subsidies, they have been much greater than anything given to the green industry. But it's something to take into account. And there's also a risk that, by the way, after developing new technologies with public funds, private entities also demand copyright. So they prevent the export of technology to the global south, which would be essential for a global transition. Okay, then maybe my last point would be about tension with democratic politics. Again, we need investments, we need initiatives for the green transition, and we have seen the Critical Raw Material Act, we have seen the Net Zero Industry Act in the EU, very important legislative measures. Now we need to check implementation. Presumably, we will see a large-scale deployment of solar panels, photovoltaic panels, and wind turbines in Europe. It is important that this happens in consultation with local communities, because there are already cases, maybe in countries, in member states, with, let's say, more controversial governance. So where we see, but not only that, where we see that there are big projects with no consultation with local communities and with no clear rationale. I can make, well, one example from Southern Europe: massive deployment of wind power in Sardinia, so an island which is disconnected from the main European grid. So it's unclear who this energy is for, and definitely the locals don't like it because they already have quite a lot of renewables for their own consumption. At the other end of Europe, in Finland, there is a debate concerning critical raw materials mining and the rights, the land rights of the local Sami population. So these are tensions that the EU needs to look into, because if it doesn't, they will be exploited by various types of politicians. Thank you very much. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Marco. We will now move to Louise van Schaik, head of the EU and Global Affairs at the Clingendael Institute. Louise coordinates Clingendael research in the field of climate change and sustainable development. In her research, she has extensively analyzed the EU's performance in multilateral bodies, including in the field of climate change, health, and food standards. She has also published on related research areas such as EU foreign policy, EU climate change and energy policy, EU research policy, scarcity of natural resources, and green growth. Louise, my question would be related to the EU's role as a potential future exporter of green transition. Do you think we have the technological standard and economic capabilities to do so? And what are the main financial and political obstacles in this respect?
Thank you, Leonela, and thank you for inviting me for this webinar, which I think illustrates that a lot of things in the field of climate change are not to be taken for granted. And I'm afraid that's also something we see in some countries in Europe popping up. Indeed, I think that's a bit the idea of the European Green Deal, that by moving forward on the green agenda, we can also make our economy stronger and more competitive. This is something which is shared among elites in Europe, in Brussels. In some countries it's shared, and in other countries it's less shared, and it's also not equally shared among the population. So let's say there's different political viewpoints and trusts in this idea. But if we look overall, I think the green growth idea, especially with the war in Ukraine, indeed, it has proved us right, because we've seen that the dependency on fossil energy has really caused us a lot of trouble. And I would like to emphasize that that's the case in a lot of countries in the world. If you look across the world, there's only few exceptions where fossil has been used to also boost, let's say, a country's economy, and perhaps Norway is the only example. In many, many places, fossil energy is either a cost factor for a country, or it's something where only corrupt elites profit from, to put it bluntly, and not the local population where the fossil is extracted. So this is something, the fossil energy as a risk factor, but also an instability factor in many countries in the world. It's not only Russia that uses energy as a weapon, it's also our dependency on Qatar that was already mentioned. Today, Azerbaijan, the gas deal, maybe not so nice in light of the happenings in Nagorno-Karabakh. So there is a lot of Libya, there's a lot of countries where we have a relationship with, where, you know, we know that the income of the fossil revenues are not benefiting the marginalized groups in the society, but basically elites that use it sometimes even to wage war. So that's a point I first wanted to make. Another point I would like to make is indeed that there is a huge transformation going on, which also provides economic opportunities. And the ones who really got this first are, of course, the Chinese. I mean, the Chinese have subsidized solar panels, now electric vehicles, wind turbines, a lot of the new technologies in the new economy. The batteries that you need, because you can indeed have a sustainable energy system without fossil, because you can have batteries, you can have hydrogen. So there is really a different energy system possible without fossil, and that's also economically viable. The question is really, so how do you make sure as Europe that you take a position in this? And in the foresight analysis of the European Union, there have been also analysis where can the EU still take a competitive edge? And I think a lot of the industrial policies that are now being developed also go into that direction. And there is some tension, I think, Marco, you pointed to that, with also our ambition to have a level playing field and a multilateral approach to this issue. But frankly speaking, with the Chinese subsidies, but also with the US IRA and the Made in the US label within the IRA, so that only the products produced in the US are supported. For instance, Ørsted lost 30% of its value on the stock markets, the Danish wind production company, because it could not apply for the IRA funding. So, I mean, this is probably, I'm afraid, a given for Europe. So we have to kind of also respond to that. Von der Leyen is now doing that with the probe into the electric vehicles, but there might be needed a more structural approach. And at the same time, we are at risk that with this, let's say, structural answer, and with these green industrial policies, we undermine the internal market within the EU for these products. Because then within the EU, the countries with the deeper pockets for green industrial policies might outcompete the other countries. So we have to kind of find smart policy solutions that on the one hand help the EU, let's say, against the big power offenses on this issue of green tech, so that we keep a position. On the other hand, that we don't make this a part of a new neo-colonial imperialistic agenda for the EU. It's clear that we only do this green tech because we want to make a profit out of it to the detriment of other countries. And a third point is that we have to make sure that we don't undermine, let's say, our own internal markets values, and that we keep, let's say, also a market and a competitive market for these products, so that the market selects also technologies which are really the best ones and the cheapest ones for the longer term. So I guess that's a bit the challenges that I wanted to talk about. I'll leave it here for the moment. I also wanted to say that, let's say, the transition as such, the green transition as such, we know also that in Europe it's not a walk in the park. So it's not easy. And only in my own country, we recently discovered that the fossil subsidies were not 4 billion that we expected, but they were over 40 billion. So we see that there is still also within Europe a lot of things to do, and also the farmer protests, and also some movements in society that are, afraid of the transition. The more conservative forces are done. But maybe we can leave that for the discussion later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Louise, for so many interesting points. I think now we can move on to our debate, and I will ask, first of all, our panelists if you have any questions, and then we can move to... Yes, Martin, please.
Thank you. Now, I was happy to hear about highlighting one of the challenges, and I think this is something which is, in terms of the long-term competitiveness of Europe, really, really crucial. And that's the question of, we are investing public money into especially the research and development. And I think Horizon Europe is really amazing flagship program that we have. But then what we face is, especially in the scale-up phase of the SMEs, they tend to leave Europe for other countries, and a large part of the reason, what having talked intensely with the whole ecosystem, is the financing. That in Europe we lack the appropriate financing mechanism and the whole ecosystem of a venture financing that not only it is in the Silicon Valley. When we look at the Israeli approach with the sovereign fund and the financing of startups and scale-ups they're doing, so there is lots of not just private but sovereign financing, and how can we learn from that, not necessarily replicate one-to-one, but what could be the best way to ensure that we have the financing for the clean tech scale-ups in Europe. And also, how can we make sure that we finally get the single market working properly? Because I think we have the challenge that one of the issues is the regulatory divergence between the different member states on a number of issues, not just the lack of proper capital markets, but also in terms of the other aspects. When you want to build a factory, when you want to build a factory is a very simple example. So where I would like to ask the distinguished speakers, where do you think we could improve, or how we can improve this, so we actually, from the competitiveness perspective, retain the scales ups in Europe, so they create more jobs in Europe, they create the economy, they help the economy to develop, and also they bring in the tax revenue, because those all very well needed. And we have lots of amazing clean tech scale ups that we are losing to US or China. Thank you.
Sorry. Do we have any comments from the other panelists?
Well, the fundamental problem is that costs in China for these production of these renewables are much lower than in Europe and in the United States, because China subsidizes the labor. There's often the wage rates are lower. There's forced labor from Xinjiang. The energy costs are lower because they're building 2 new coal-fired power plants a week and they don't care about environmental regulations. And the capital costs are lower because they subsidize interest rates and reduce interest rates on loans for their favored industries. So it's very difficult for us on the one hand to say renewables are competitive price-wise, and then say they have to be built in the United States and the EU. And that's one thing that all of our countries are struggling with. So Chinese electric vehicles are taking over in Latin America. They're starting to take over in Europe. And this is a problem for the workers, the employees of these companies in Europe. And I'd also just like to comment that these models that are predicting, the IPCC models, have consistently over-predicted. If you look at charts of where temperatures are supposed to be now, that were put out at the beginning of the century or the end of last century, they are consistently lower than they were predicted to be. If you look at the movie made by Vice President Al Gore called An Inconvenient Truth, well, the inconvenient truth for him is that nothing in the movie, like Manhattan being underwater, has happened. The mean IPCC temperature differential, if we do nothing, is 2.5 degrees. We cannot reduce that mean temperature or their larger, more sensitive temperature of 5 degrees without the help of China and Asia. If they do not come on board, and they show no signs of coming on board, we will never achieve that temperature reduction, even if we do achieve net zero 2050, which I argue that we will not achieve. And we were discussing the costs of LNG coming from countries like Qatar and the problems with that. We also need to look at the environmental degradation from mining of the minerals that goes into these batteries that not only power the electric vehicles, but they are backups and storage for wind and solar. For a battery, an average EV battery that weighs about 450 kilos, you need to move 227,000 kilos of materials of Earth in order to get the minerals to power that one battery. So there's a lot of environmental degradation that goes along with that. And this is something that we should not be ignoring. Plus, Elisabetta talked about, well, there are some hiccups on the way. I mean, look at the United States, look at Europe, look at Rishi Sunak moving back from his net zero target. Look at the people, look at the riots in the Netherlands and Belgium when people are told to change their methods of agriculture. Look at the farmers rioting. Look at the Gilets jaunes in France and the people who are unhappy in parts of Germany. There are major political problems with raising electricity prices on the population, especially on poor people, and taking away their jobs and shipping these jobs over to China and India, countries that have stated clearly that they have no intention of complying with any environmental standards.
I see Louise has a comment. Louise, please.
I think you rightly point out to concerns about sustainable mining practices and also the requirements that we need for new critical materials. But I also would like to emphasize that there is a difference between the substances that we need for the batteries and the solar panels and the wind energy. because with critical raw materials, you mine them and then you use them. And in theory, you can reuse them if you set up proper recycling systems. Whereas with fossil, you pump them up and then you burn them and then there's gone, you know. So there is really a difference between the fossil energy and the critical materials. So I also don't think you can completely compare, let's say, the dependencies on these two, because it's often now framed as, oh, if we get rid of our fossil fuels, we go into a new dependency. But it's really a different kind of dependency. And something else I would really like to emphasize is I don't think it is indeed feasible that we shift all the production of all clean technologies from China to the EU or the US. But I think it would be healthy if also other places in the world would be found where these things can be produced maybe at lower costs. So the idea of self-sufficiency and autarky in the EU, and this is also why I think von der Leyen talks about de-risking and not decoupling, is clear, and we should look critically at the markets. But it's also true that indeed the cost factors are so different in our economies. But I think it's more interesting in that respect to look, for instance, at the candidate countries of the EU, which are lower income countries, or countries close to the EU. I think in that respect, the EU-India Middle East corridor that was mentioned in the G20 could be potentially interesting. So we need to find, let's say, new ways to look at our value change and our dependencies to enhance this open strategic autonomy, but not having the illusion that we can work towards autarky, because I think that's not a realistic prospect. And also in a world where we've always fought for free trade, it's also perhaps not what we want eventually.
Yes, but we are going to need fossil fuels to make the renewables. You cannot make a wind turbine without fossil fuels. It calls for steel and cement. You can't make solar panels without fossil fuels. And you also need fossil fuels to back up the wind turbines because the wind doesn't always blow. And you also need...
I beg to differ, because you can make these products with electricity and hydrogen, and we are now developing these economies, and that's also available. So I think, I mean, energy is energy. It can be electricity, and if you need something which is more strong, then you can use hydrogen, or you can even use nuclear, where you don't have CO2. So I don't see the need for fossil fuels to produce renewable energy. I really don't see the need for that. I think it's not a valid argument, sorry to say.
Marco, I see your...
use nuclear. You can certainly use nuclear, but a lot of the people who are in favor of renewables seem to be very much against nuclear. But yes, I would say that nuclear is the ideal solution. It's dense energy and safe. France has used nuclear very successfully, powers about 60% of its electricity with nuclear, and we have nuclear submarines that have never had accidents. So I would say nuclear is definitely the solution. So I'm glad that this is something that we agree on.
Marco, I invite you to continue, please.
Thank you. Just a few points. First of all, it is true that, for example, electric cars won't save the world, in the sense that we can't just have mass motorization based on electric cars. You still need a lot of resources for that. So the problem there is mass motorization. We need system transformation and persuasion that we do not need to use the car all the time. So car sharing solutions. This is also very important. We can't just stay with the same system, simply switching from fossil to renewables. A couple of points that came up. So China, India, they're big polluters. However, it's not true that they say they don't care about climate change. They even pledged actually to a climate neutrality target. It's too late, 2060, 2070, but there is concern. And this is not just out of, this is not just public diplomacy. It's also because an authoritarian regime like the Chinese regime loses domestic support if cities are too polluted. So they also have an interest, and there are common points that we should work on also with them. Now, the question with nuclear, there is a huge debate also in Europe, as you know. Some countries are in favor, some countries are against. Well, the French nuclear sector at the moment has lots of issues, actually, and as we know from last summer. There are the usual problems, you know, spent fuel risks. If we talk about the downsides, and also on a global scale, if the West wants to go into this, I mean, right now the situation is that 1/3 of reactors worldwide are being built in China, and the company with the biggest global portfolio of orders is Rosatom. So the West would need to make a huge investment, and here I'm talking about both the US and the EU to be competitive in this field. And so the point here is it worth investing in nuclear, large plants which take a very long time to complete? Here in Finland, one entered into service this year. It was planned for 2009. So costs skyrocketed, and you also had to find electricity for those 14 years where the plant was not operational. So there are maybe some partial solutions. People talk about small modular reactors, but again, it's quite a complex area. And again, there's no easy answer, but the question is it worth investing billions in this, or is it better to go for renewable energy that is more readily available and increasingly cheap? Just to say something on the nuclear issue.
Marco, I'm very glad that you brought up Russia as well, because it's the only topic that we haven't, only major player, let's say, that we haven't touched upon. But unfortunately, we have less than 2 minutes, and I would like to wrap up by having just one sentence as a conclusion from each of the panelists. I would start with Elisabetta, if possible.
Thank you, Leonela. I think I liked one expression that Louise used, and that is that the green transition is not a walk in the park. I think we're basically talking about a large-scale industrial revolution, like we've seen on a global scale previously in the past, and none of these have been easy to roll out, not from a technological perspective, not from a social acceptability perspective. And I think all the challenges associated with it are clear to all series of observers of this. And that is why I think whenever we discuss this issue, it is about finding policies that can match our climate and our energy transition objectives in a way that maintain Europe competitive, and in a way that keep the social acceptability and social justice balance for its population. So I think this is the challenge, but it's one that we're very well aware of, and that we strive to do justice to with policy recommendations that make sense. Stop.
Martin, would you like to continue?
Yes, thank you. We have an incredible opportunity in our hands with which we can avert existential threat to our civilization, which can help us to lower the cost that they already caused global warming will have on the population. And I think it's really one of our biggest tasks is to make sure that we utilize this opportunity, and we utilize it for the benefit of all Europeans, to make sure that the transformation is indeed, on one hand, socially just, and doesn't leave the lower income families behind, but also creates the opportunities for everybody really to come up with new ideas, to come up with things which haven't been thought possible before. And just like we are seeing the digital revolution changing our lives in many cases for better, I think we should and have to use the green transition and the climate transition for making our lives better.
Thank you. Maybe Diana, you will continue.
Sure. Well, first of all, I want to thank you so much for inviting me to this debate. I really appreciate the opportunity. I would just like to say that I agree that we are looking at a large-scale industrial revolution. The problem is that with this revolution, we're making electricity more expensive. We are making poor people poorer. We're increasing inequities, as some people can afford the more expensive energy and other people can't. At the same time, because the whole world is not moving on this industrial revolution, only the West has signed on to it. We are making Asia stronger because they have not signed on to it. They are using the cheaper forms of energy. They are using coal-fired power. They're using fossil fuels. They're using their geopolitical influence to build fossil fuel projects and the Belt and Road project in Africa, for example. And I would say the West is weakening itself, causing major political problems among people who do not like their jobs displaced and who do not want to pay the higher cost for electricity. So a better solution would be to see if we could spread technology throughout the entire world, emissions-free dense energy such as natural gas and nuclear power that provide efficient forms of energy with low emissions so that people in Africa and Latin America can achieve our standards of living. And we are not telling them that they have to make do with renewables, because there's not one African country right now that has achieved Western standards of living with fossil fuels. And the strongest country economically in Africa, South Africa, is using a lot of fossil fuels. And is having problems, by the way, because use of those fossil fuels is declining. Eskom, and they're having blackouts right now, showing that renewables cannot really replace fossil fuels when they cease to function. And again, I want to thank you, Leonela, for including me in the debate. When you told me it was the debate, I didn't know it was going to be 4 against 1, or I would have asked for a more fair playing field, but I'm very, very honored to be included, and thank you for having me.
Thank you, Diana. Marco, would you like to continue?
Well, let me just say that I agree that climate change is the biggest threat and emergency today. So my final point, especially for young generations, is that they shouldn't fall into geopolitical narratives and divides, especially from Cold War times or similar things. And we should rather seek a transformational and cooperative narrative that addresses the main challenge. And the main challenge, in my opinion, is not China. It's not the war in Ukraine either. It's climate change in the long run, even though without taking anything from the other challenges. But we should keep in mind what the existential threat for the planet is.
Thank you. And Louise, would you like to wrap up this?
Yeah, I thought I want to also bring in a little bit of a constructive, positive note. We did some research 2 years ago on Kenya. Kenya is actually a country with 95% renewable electricity. They use geothermal, so the warmth from the ground, which is another technology not so often talked about. So there are these examples, and also it has proved Kenya really resilient with the economy crisis, because that was especially due to the fossil energy prices going up because of the war and the geopolitical turmoil. And we've seen that in the past, that fossil energy prices can be extremely volatile. So I think the case of Kenya also shows, and there's more examples, but also, for instance, now Morocco with solar panels production, solar energy production, that there is also a real prospect of these prices coming down and of this idea of growth working in practice for the people. And I hope that we can showcase as Europe that we can help with that we can also export our technologies, also the twin transition of green and digital. For instance, that you use the electricity in the time that the wind blows and the sun is shining, and your dishes or your laundry. or that you recharge your car at these moments in time. And there is countries already advanced in that, but again, I hope that everybody can share these innovations and technologies, and that we have cleaner air, cleaner water, and also a better climate eventually. Thank you, and also thank you, Leonela, for the invitation. It was very good, and I hope also that we can work in the future with the transatlantic partners on this important issue. Thank you so much.
I totally agree, and thank you everybody for joining. I think we have at least one conclusion, that there is a lot of there are a lot of things that we have to do from now on. I totally agree with Marco that the biggest threat is, of course, the climate change, while we must pay attention to the global confrontation, which is right now engaging the global south, and this confrontation is growing. I think at the same time that we need to focus on technological cooperation. While it is possible and it is happening in the Western world, it is less possible for the moment in regards with China. And we have to discuss all these topics in the future as well. But let's keep in mind that even if the short or medium term goal is ensuring energy security, we are on the right path of energy transformation and energy green transition, and we must put our efforts into at least debating it from different angles. It is true, but as a constructive discussion. So thank you very much. I was very happy to meet you and to discuss with you, and hope we will have same opportunities in the future. And also my colleague Federica here will have some comments. Thank you once again.
No, I wanted to remind everyone to fill in the survey that it's in the chat. It's very important for us as we are reporting on the conclusions of our activities to the EU itself. So you would support us by doing it. Thank you.
Thank you once again, and let's keep in touch, and I look forward to cooperate with you in the future. Thank you.